So, hi everyone. I am going to speak about something that comes a little bit before your submission, which is how to choose the journal that you might want to consider submitting to. Who am I? I am an executive publisher of Elsevier in biochemistry. That does not mean I am a biochemist. So I work on a suite of journals. You're good. I'm okay here. Okay, thank you. I work on the BBA journals, which is Biochemica and Biophysica Acta. It's 10 journals, as well as one open access journal that has been around for about 10 years, BB Reports. Also work on BBRC and the brand new Disease and Therapeutics. So a really good place to start if you don't know where your manuscript would fit in, maybe because you don't have a lot of experience in submitting to journals, or maybe because you're doing something that is very different from what you've done before, is to speak to your colleagues, speak to your PI, talk in your department about what might be a good home for this paper. Look at your own bibliography. What journals are you citing? Where is most of the research that you're using in your literature coming from? But also we have some pretty good journal finders. Elsevier has its own. It's just journal finder.elsevier.com. But there's also other ones. For instance, Jane is a pretty good one for life science papers. You just input your abstract and it will extract information from it to tell you which journals might be suitable based on content that's been published there before, but also on the scope. Speaking of scope, you really want to consider whether your research, fits the scope. You might hear this a lot today because surprisingly, a lot of people don't read beyond the journal title or what they think might fit with the scope. But the scope statements of journals, sometimes they're very generic and not super helpful. But a lot of the time they will say, especially in these fields where we're getting more and more submissions, specifically what journals are not interested in. So for instance, I have a journal called BBA Reviews on Cancer. And, it's right there, says on the title, it's a reviews journal. We get a lot of non-review papers. In your area specifically, a lot of journals will not accept papers without some kind of wet lab validation. Still, we receive those papers, even though it's stated in the scope specifically that we do not. And then you have other journals that invite these submissions. For instance, in silico research and biomedicine, which is one of Elsevier's new journals, they say specifically in silico studies with or without validation, welcome. Metrics. This one's a little controversial, but there might be really good reasons why metrics matter to you. Where journals are indexed might matter for your funder. It might matter for your career advancement. And so making sure that it does meet those base criteria. You might not need the highest impact factor. Maybe that is something that is really important for where you are in your career, because you might want to be able to say, I have a paper in Cell or Nature or Science, so that you can be competitive. But a lot of the time, that is not the most important thing, but at least you need to tick some boxes of indexation so that your paper can be considered by your institute or wherever you're looking to apply for as a publication. A journal's reputation is also very important, and more so as we get more and more journals in the fields. Does your research group, do your colleagues know of this journal? Do they have a particular opinion about how rigorous the peer review processes? I get a lot of FaceTime with editors in my journals who are quite high up, in their career. And the most common thing that I hear is, I sit on a lot of panels, and then you have these ECRs, and they bring in these publications from journals that we wouldn't even dream to put anywhere, because, that's a wasted paper for their career. Is that completely fair? That's a whole other question, but it is how it works. And so it's a good thing to consider. Also, reputation nowadays is more and more related to ethics. And so making sure that you have a journal that takes ethics seriously, that has a protocol for handling when things go wrong. Also to you as an author, things can happen, mistakes can happen, especially when it comes to images. I see it all the time. Researchers that are very advanced in their careers, suddenly there's one paper from 10 years ago where someone finds an issue and they have to defend it. You want to make sure that you're with a journal that is going to give you a fair due process. And all of Elsevier's journals are members of COPE, which is the Committee of Publication Ethics, which tends to be the gold standard for the industry. I would argue that probably most reputable publishers are members, but it is a good place to consider. Finally, editorial board composition is something that was spoken about before. To some degree, it can be, especially if it's a new journal and it looks interesting and the scope fits what you're doing. Do I know the people who are working on this journal? Have I heard of these institutes? Are they representative of my field? But also, how geographically representative is this journal? Elsevier posts this information. So we actually, on the editorial board pages, you will find what the geographical makeup is of the editorial board, but also the gender makeup, which in computer science, I guess you would have a lot, or bioinformatics more generally, but to be honest, most of biochemistry is not exactly 50-50, but you would always think, how are other journals comparable to this one doing in that regard? So you're not comparing, you would want the most equitable journal necessarily, but is it particularly skewed in one direction? Do we have only editors from North America who are men? So those kinds of things you might want to consider, because it could indicate some sort of bias. So it's a good thing to have a look at. Guide for authors. I think this goes without saying that it's a good idea to make sure, again, this has to do with whether your paper type is compliant, because the last thing that you want to avoid, you're going to spend at least a couple of hours preparing a submission at best. Even when you haven't done your homework and looked at the guide for authors, that's just how long it takes. And if you're going through that process to only get desk rejected because you missed something really obvious, that's not a great use of your time. It's not a great use of editor's time. And you're just going to have to do it all over again. So definitely check the guide for authors. Make sure that if it says this paper type, only 8 figures, that you only have 8 figures, and so on and so forth. The peer review process. This one is, again, really field dependent. And so for instance, before working in biochemistry, I worked in social sciences where double anonymized was the gold standard. And if you didn't have a double anonymized journal, that would not be considered a good journal. Make sure that the journal that you're submitting to adheres to the standards of your fields, and not because that cannot change. And we're going to have a talk from eLife later where their peer review system is quite different. But make sure that this is generally going to be, again, related to reputation, that this is going to be, in your favor. And one of the reasons that you want to consider that is also considering time. So if speed is the most important thing to you, you do want to make sure that you're submitting your paper to a journal where you're not going to spend, a year editing. And revisions do take time, but journals that are particularly stringent, particularly rigorous, that take you through, really the ranks, you go through several rounds of revision. That might be worth it if you have the time, but if you do not have the time, let's say you have to publish a paper to get your PhD, or, there's a very good reason why you need to get that out, then you might be looking at this very closely. And a lot of publishers, Elsevier publishes this, but a lot of other publishers do also publish their time. Journal financial model. If you have to publish open access, which isn't always the case, there are several ways that you can do that. The majority of subscription journals, certainly all of Elsevier's, as far as I know, also offer an open access option, but you need to do your homework also on whether you have to do that, why you have to do that, how you have to do that, because if green open access is also an option, then funding is not a concern for you, because after an embargo period, you're able to just share your accepted manuscript. But if it is important that it's immediately open access, that it is under an open access license for your funder, for your institute, for whatever reason, you need to do your homework to find out that you can cover that article publishing charge. And yes, I'm at 0 minutes now. And that's great because I've gotten to my last slide, which is what if you fail at your first choice? So you've spent all this time considering all the stuff that I told you and you chose the perfect journal and then you get rejected. At Elsevier, but a lot of other big publishers, we have something called the article transfer service, in which we use data from other articles that have been transferred to journals within our ecosystem to give authors options where we think their manuscript has a pretty good chance of being accepted. So you will be offered at that point the option to, okay, look, you didn't make the bar here for whatever reason, maybe after review, maybe before review, but we think this manuscript has a pretty good chance in another journal. If you say yes and submit, then you don't have to re-prepare. You don't have to think about which journal to send to. We just send it that way for you. So that's everything. Thank you.